Since the beginning of human history, whenever we as human beings have wrestled with those big questions of life, questions like, why am I here? What is our purpose in life? Why is there so much suffering and heartache in the world? Where did we come from? Whenever we've tried to answer those big questions, more often than not, from culture to culture, generation to generation, we have turned to our storytellers for the answers. Those men and women who have this unique ability to tell stories that give us insights into all those big why questions. Sometimes they'll tell true stories based on real events. And other times they'll tell us fictional stories. Stories that are truth nonetheless because they speak about the reality of the human condition. And we have a lot of those stories in our culture. When we were kids, we were raised on things called fairy tales. And those fairy tales sometimes were scary, or they were bizarre, or they were funny, or they were playful. But fairy tales tend to look at those why questions. They give us little insights into life, and a lot of them end with the moral of the story. In literature, we have something that takes us a bit deeper. We call those myths. Now, in the 21st century, we often talk about myths as lies, but in literature, a myth is an epic story about the whys of life. And myths in particular deal with the beginnings of life, with stuff that happened before recorded history, to help us understand our place in the world, why we're here, how we got to be here. So when I was a kid in grade school, my favorite time of year in school was when we got to the back of the reading book, for two reasons. The pictures in the back of the reading book were all in color, and secondly, they were Greek mythology stories. And I loved those stories. I loved the adventure stories about Hercules and the gods and the goddesses. And as I got a little older, I realized that was the Greeks' way of understanding the world a few thousand years ago. That's how they tried to answer meaning questions, was through Greek mythology. And so every culture has their myths, their stories of why we're here. Every generation has had their myths, their big, grand stories that speak truth about our existence. And so it should come as no surprise then that the Jews have their own set of stories. And they've compiled them in the Bible. Now, some of their stories are true stories based on real events, real people, stories of Abraham and Moses and Joshua. Many of those stories are cautionary tales about life. So, for example, we have the story of King David and the use and abuse of power. Some of those stories are meant to inspire faith and heroism in us, like the stories of Daniel and Ruth and Esther. And some of the stories in the Bible, particularly the stories in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, are what we call myth with a big capital M, because it is truth with a capital T. That is meant, those stories are meant to try to answer not the how questions of life, but the why questions of life. Why are we here? Where did we come from? Why is life so messed up? Is there a God? And if there's a God, what is this God like? And so the stories in Genesis chapter 1 through 11 are what we call these big, grand, epic myth stories with a capital M. Stories that seek to give us insights into those big questions through metaphor and through symbols and through poetry and through images. And so in Genesis chapter 1 through 11, we have what in many ways is the prologue to the entire Bible. It sets the stage for everything else that will happen in the Bible. It introduces us to the major characters of the Bible. It introduces us to the major themes of the Bible. And so we have introduced to us God, the Creator. We're introduced to humanity. We're introduced to God's relationship with His creation. And we begin to see those overarching themes that will come up again and again about God, humanity, and the human condition. So Genesis chapter 1 begins with a big bang. God is hovering over the chaos, and God begins to speak. And when He speaks, something happens. He begins to create the world. And so what Genesis chapter 1 is a poem. It's a metaphor. And the metaphor that Genesis chapter 1 uses is the metaphor of a work week. You can picture God picking up His lunchbox every day, going off to work, and what He does is He speaks, much like Pastor Tim, but when God speaks, something really big happens. So each day, He speaks and something happens. Now, each day when he's done, packs up his lunchbox, he looks over his work and he says, that's good stuff. And then we get to day 6. And day 6 is really sort of the highlight of the poem. And God creates his masterpiece. He creates his greatest work of art. He creates us, humanity. And when he's done, he steps back and he says, that's very good. And so Genesis chapter 1 is this poem. It's a metaphor, so to speak, not of how God created the world, but that God created the world and why God created the world. He created it because he's creative and because he has some love to give and he wants to give it to his children. Genesis chapter 2 further expands our insights into God and tells us that God is a doting father who created us so that he could lavish all of this grace onto his children. And the symbol for that is the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is this symbol of God's lavish grace on his children. And so Adam and Eve have access to everything in the garden, everything they could possibly want or need, God has given to them, with the exception of one tree. And that tree is there to remind Adam and Eve that there are some things that belong to God and God alone, that they're not God and God is. And that's a good thing. There's a reminder that they're dependent on God. And so it says that Adam and Eve ran around the garden naked, which symbolically means that they had nothing to hide. Everything was open. Their relationship with God was pure. It was honest. It was good. Now, when we read that story, and we hear about the Garden of Eden, there's something deep down in our souls that resonates with that. And we come up with the word for that. We call that paradise. And deep in our souls, we know we were created for that. Why do we know that? Because we are so disturbed when life is not like paradise. We're disturbed by brokenness. We're disturbed by pain and violence and greed and racism. All of those things disturb us because we know in our soul we were created for paradise. And so we read that great epic story about the Garden of Eden and we start to ask ourselves those big questions. What went wrong? What happened to paradise? And so then we get the next big epic story, Genesis chapter 3. This powerful metaphor that begins to give us insights not into how things fell apart, but why. And the story includes a talking snake, a piece of fruit, some itchy, scratchy fig leaves, and some bushes. And on the surface, it seems like a little kid's story. But then as you read it, as happens with every great story, it begins to get into our souls and we say, now we know why life is the way it is. So for those of you who are visiting with us today, we are beginning today a journey through the Bible. We're using particularly a version of the Bible called the Story. And many of us read the first chapter today, which took us through the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And today we're going to zero in on that powerful, profound story of Genesis chapter 3, which gives us insights into God, into the human condition, and sets the stage for the rest of the Bible. Adam and Eve were walking through the Garden of Eden, enjoying this beautiful paradise that God had created for them, everything available to them that they could possibly want. It's one of those Chamber of Commerce Phoenix days where it's just beautiful, about 75 degrees outside. They've got all of this fruit around them. They can have anything they want except, of course, the one tree that belongs to God. And then the day is interrupted when a talking snake asks Eve a question. The snake said, "Did God really say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden'?" Now, the snake knew perfectly well that's not what God said. Wasn't even anywhere near close. But what the snake wants to do at this point is to begin to sow some seeds of doubt into Eve's mind, to begin to confuse her. And so Eve, seeing a talking snake, and apparently that's not a big deal, she answers him by trying to correct him. She said, "No, God said we could eat from all the trees of the garden except the one in the middle. We can't even touch it or we will die." Now, she's pretty close. God did say that if they eat from that tree, that they would die. What he didn't say was that if they touch it, they'll die. Now, it seems like a small little thing, but already Eve is a little bit confused. And so the serpent sees his opening, and he continues. He says, you won't die, because God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. You see, Eve, you can't trust God. He's holding out on you. He's got something that he's keeping for himself that you could really use. You could really benefit from it. And it's found right there. Go for it. Well, now he has her attention. And so Eve begins to look at this fruit with fresh eyes. And she recognizes how beautiful it is and how shiny it is. It's sort of like when you're shopping and you're picking up apples and you always go for the shiniest one, the one without the bruises. That's what she sees. And pretty soon she starts feeling like she really has to have it. And now it becomes an obsession. It becomes a lust. She's drawn by the desire of it, and she starts to reason with herself as to why it should be okay to eat this. After all, how can something that feels so right be wrong? And what would be the big deal of taking one little bite? Who's it going to hurt? And God's probably not going to know anyway. And so, overcome by her desire, overcome by lust, and her need to be like God and to want what belongs only to God, she picks that piece of fruit, she takes a bite, she gives it to Adam, who's standing right next to her. He takes a bite, and wow, does it taste delicious, and bam, just like that, everything changes. They begin to feel things and experience things they've never felt before. Guilt, shame, disfigurement, disgust. They look at each other and they see that they're naked, not in the sense of Genesis 2 where there's nothing to hide, but now in the sense where they're vulnerable, there's something to hide. They feel dirty about it. And then they hear God walking in the garden. He's coming to see them. He's coming to play with them. And rather than running to God like kids normally do when mom or dad come home from work, like Adam and Eve used to do, this time they run into the bushes. They put on some itchy, scratchy fig leaves, and they hide from God. Why does life at times seem so messed up? Why is there suffering in the world? Why is it that you do the things you don't want to do and you don't do the things that you should do? Why is it that there's greed and lust and racism and terrorism in this world? Why is it that sometimes life seems a little bit and sometimes a lot of bit out of whack? Why is there evil in the world? Well, the story gives us some insights. Not as to how it happened, but why. It's there because of our propensity to run from God. To believe that we can manage our lives better than God can. It comes from our overwhelming desire to always have stuff that doesn't belong to us, to want more, to never be satisfied with what we have. It comes from our listening to the wrong kinds of voices, listening to half-truths that promise us that if we do what these voices say, we'll have power in life. And in the end, those voices leave us feeling naked and vulnerable. And so Genesis chapter 3 is really the story of the human condition. It's the story of how we run from God. It's the story of how we think we can manage our lives better than God can. It's the story of our trying to be like God, of wanting things that don't belong to us and taking things that don't belong to us, listening to the wrong voices. And as a result, we live life naked, vulnerable, and ashamed. Hans Christian Andersen tells the story this way. Once upon a time, there lived a vain emperor whose only worry in life was to dress in elegant clothes. He changed clothes almost every hour and loved to show them off to his people. Word of the emperor's refined habits spread over his kingdom and beyond. Two scoundrels who had heard of the emperor's vanity decided to take advantage of it. They introduced themselves at the gate of the palace with a scheme in mind. We are two very good tailors. And after many years of research, we have invented an extraordinary method to weave cloth so light and fine that it looks invisible. As a matter of fact, it is invisible to anyone who is too stupid and incompetent to appreciate its quality. Besides being invisible, Your Highness, this cloth will be woven in colors and patterns created especially for you. Well, the emperor gave the two men a bag of gold in exchange for their promise to begin working on the fabric immediately. Just tell us what you need to get started and we'll give it to you. The two scoundrels asked for a loom, silk, gold thread, and then pretended to begin working. The emperor thought he had spent his money quite well. In addition to getting a new extraordinary suit, he would now discover which of his subjects were ignorant and incompetent. Well, the day came when the emperor received the announcement that the two tailors had come to take all the measurements they needed to sew his new suit. "Come in," the emperor ordered. Even as they bowed, the two scoundrels pretended to be holding large rolls of fabric. "Here it is, Your Highness, the result of our labor," the scoundrels said. "We have worked night and day, but at last the most beautiful fabric in the world is ready for you. Look at the color and feel how fine it is." Of course, the emperor did not see any colors and could not feel any cloth between his fingers, and he panicked and felt like fainting. But luckily, the throne was right behind him, and he sat down. But when he realized that no one could know that he did not see the fabric, he felt better. Nobody could find out he was stupid and incompetent, and the emperor didn't know that everybody else around him thought that and did the very same thing. So the farce continued as the two scoundrels had foreseen it. Once they had taken the measurements, the two began cutting the air with scissors while sewing with their needles and invisible cloth. "Your Highness, you'll have to take off your clothes to try on your new ones." The two scoundrels draped the new clothes on him and then held up a mirror. The emperor was embarrassed, but since none of his bystanders were, he felt relieved. "Yes, this is a beautiful suit, and it looks very good on me," the emperor said, trying to look comfortable. "You've done a fine job." "Your Majesty," the prime minister said, "we have a request for you. The people have found out about this extraordinary fabric, and they are anxious to see you in your new suit." The emperor was doubtful, showing himself naked to the people, but then he abandoned his fears. After all, no one would know about it except the ignorant and the incompetent. "All right," he said, "I'll grant the people this privilege." He summoned his carriage, and the ceremonial parade was formed. A group of dignitaries walked at the very front of the procession and anxiously scrutinized the faces of the people in the street. All the people had gathered in the main square, pushing and shoving to get a better look, and applause welcomed the regal procession. Everyone wanted to know how stupid or incompetent his or her neighbor was, but as the emperor passed, a strange murmur arose from the crowd. Everyone said loud enough for the others to hear, "Look at the emperor's new clothes, they're beautiful." A child, however, who had no important job and could only see things as his eyes showed them to him, went up to the carriage. "The emperor's naked," he said. The boy's remark, which had been heard by the bystanders, was repeated over and over again until everyone cried, "The boy is right, the emperor is naked, it's true." Well, the emperor realized that the people were right, but he could not admit to that. He thought it better to continue the procession under the illusion that anyone who couldn't see his clothes were either stupid or incompetent, and he stood stiffly on his carriage while behind him a page held his imaginary mantle. Like the emperor, like Adam and Eve, we live lives of naked vulnerability because of our propensity to run from God, because of our desire to run our own lives, because of our lust for things that don't belong to us, our dissatisfaction for life the way it is and always needing more and needing those things that don't belong to us, because we listen to the wrong voices that promise us one thing but leave us naked when we buy into it. Unlike the emperor, however, we don't have to continue to live as naked people pretending otherwise. Even though Adam and Eve had to live with the consequences of their sin, and so do we, the story doesn't end there. Because the main point of the story is that God is a God who pursues his runaway children, who looks for his runaway children in the bushes in order to clothe them with grace. And that's what God did with Adam and Eve. He sought them out. He went to where they were and he covered them with forgiveness. Just as the father covered the prodigal son with the robe of sonship, so God runs to his runaway children and covers their nakedness with the robe of sonship, the robe of daughterhood. The story of the fall is a story that resonates with us because we know at its heart it's true, because we know that we live lives of naked desperation. But the good news is that God is a God who pursues us no matter where we are, so that he can stop our running, put some clothes on us, and we can begin to follow him again, now as his sons and his daughters. The rest of the Bible is that story. of our propensity to run and God's passion to run after us and pursue us and clothe us. And so if you're tired of living a naked life, if you're tired of running, then today God comes to you through his Son Jesus to clothe you with the garments of grace and to transform you back into the son, the daughter that you were created to be. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we know from life's experience that there are a lot of things that we do that leave us feeling ashamed and guilty. And sometimes, quite honestly, we do things and we've become so calloused that, like the emperor, we live naked, but we kind of pretend we're not. And we thank you that you're a God who breaks through all of that. Our arrogance, our sin, our lusts. You find us in the bushes, you find us in the pigsty, and you call to us with a compelling call of grace, one that covers us with forgiveness, that transforms us back into sons and daughters, and empowers us to follow Jesus and live like the sons and daughters we were created to be. May that be our experience. And as we walk through the Bible together these next many, many weeks, may we hear again and again that you are a God who pursues your runaway children, and that includes us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So next week you're going to want to read chapter 2 of the story. When you came in today, you received several pieces of paper that give you the whole reading plan that we're going to be doing between now and September or October. I encourage you to put that in your story if you've got the story, or if you don't have a copy of the story, I also listed out for you all the different Bible passages so you can read the same passages that we're reading in the story. All right? The other thing that I said I would do with this series is from time to time, if there are questions that are sent to me, I would try to answer some of them during worship. And there are going to be a lot of questions. We're 21st century people reading a book that was written in what we call the pre-modern era, before people understood science and so on and so forth. And it's a very different culture. So there could be a lot of questions we ask. And I'm going to tell you right now, I can't answer all of them. I'll answer them best I can, but I'm going to answer 3 of them for you very quickly today, because these 3 come up again and again and again, not just from this reading, but over and over again. The first is this. When God created, on the 6th day, when God created the human beings, he said, let us make human beings in our image. And the question is, who is this us that God is speaking about? Well, there are 2 answers to the question. The first answer is to read it as the original writers would have intended for us to understand it, as the original readers would have understood it. And what they would have seen in that passage is a royal court, where God is addressing the royal court as they stand before him, all of these angelic beings. And so in a sense, the first meaning of it, let us create human beings in our image, it's the royal we. All right? You know how kings talk, queens talk, the royal we. So I'm going to do this, but so God instead, using the language of the court, said, let us create human beings in our image. The second answer, which is just as valid, but is one now that we understand as Christians, is that when God said, let us make human beings in our image, God was speaking as Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit. And part of being God is to live in relationship, Father, Son, and Spirit. And so to make human beings in our image, God is saying, let us make human beings relational like we are, so that human beings, in order to be fully human, need each other. You cannot be human apart from other human beings. God created us that way because God is a relational being as Trinity. All right, so those are 2 answers for why God said, let us make humans in our image. Second question, where did Cain's wife come from? Or, after Cain murdered Abel, where were all these people coming from who were going to kill Cain in vengeance? Now, if you read the stories in Genesis chapter 1 through 11 as historic events, you're going to end up with a lot of those kinds of questions that you can't answer. But those stories were not written as historical events. They are not how stories, they are why stories. And so they're not about how things happen. They're stories that are meant to sort of help us understand those big questions. And so the writers weren't interested in where Cain's wife came from. That wasn't the point of the story. The wife wasn't interested in or the writer wasn't interested in where these other people come from. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is that when we run from God, it not only leads to nakedness, it leads to violence and murder. And while we were created to live in a relationship, when we move out of relationship with God, we move out of relationship with others, and we begin to hurt and abuse each other. That's the point of that story. You have other issues. Genesis chapter 1, you have a poem where God creates the world in 6 days. The last thing God does is create human beings. In Genesis chapter 2, you have a whole different creation story where one of the first things God creates is a human being. Because these are not how stories, these are why stories. So the first story is a grand story about God's relationship to creation. The second creation story is a narrow-focused story about God's relationship to a particular part of his creation, and that's human beings. Okay? Third one, which troubles a lot of people, where in the flood story, God said he regretted making human beings and repented of it. And so I hear the question all the time, how can God regret making human beings? Remember the context. The people writing these stories lived in a very, very different day than we did. There were all kinds of flood stories in the Middle East. Every major culture had its own flood story. And so there was some kind of flood, whether it was a worldwide flood or whether it was just a local flood. But when you're local back in those days, that's your world. The entire world is a square block. So if your square block is flooded, the whole world is flooded, right? Because they had no perspective of the world. And back, thousands of years ago, the way that people interpreted events was always through God. If something happened, God did it. Now, in the 21st century, we recognize that that's not necessarily the case. There are things that God put in motion, for example. There are storms that happen. There's so on and so forth. And so we don't say, well, God killed all those people with a tornado. We would never think of doing that. But in a mindset from way, 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 way back before science, everything. The rain God made it rain. The sun God made the sun come out. The grass God makes the grass grow. The fertility God made you pregnant. Everything was based on God. So when Jews were trying to interpret the story of the flood, why did this happen? They put it in God language. And one of the things that they wanted to tease out was the deep-hearted brokenness that God experienced at the sinfulness of his people. It's using very strong language, God repented, but what it's basically trying to say is, like any parent, God's heart was broken by his children rebelling against him, and he was deeply saddened. There are a lot of us who are parents sitting in this room who know exactly what that's like. We've got a prodigal son, we've got a prodigal daughter, we've got sons or daughters who are on drugs, sons and daughters who have done horrific things. They're in jail, they're here. We have parents who are wrestling with that, and your hearts have been deeply shattered by the pain of your children doing those kinds of things. And what Genesis wants to tell us is God gets it. Because in Genesis chapter 2, God is a doting father. By Genesis chapter 6, he's a doting father whose heart has been absolutely ripped apart by his children who are behaving so abominably. All right? So those are a few questions that you've asked. Starting next week now, we get into real history, the story of Abraham. And I haven't decided which story we're going to look at yet, because there's a lot of great Abraham stories, but we'll pick one of them. So read through chapter 2, all right?